So take us through New York City's complaint against Chipotle first, and then we can zoom out to the rest of the country because so New York City, I mean, is this under Tish James's jurisdiction? Is that correct?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, she's been doing a lot of good things. Is that's just why I wanted to put that out there. She's also overseeing the Cuomo investigation, amongst other things. And
I should just say, so it's being filed. The complaint is being filed by the Department of Consumer and Worker Protection at the Office of Administrative Trials and Hearings.
Gotcha.
So
Okay,
as
so
far as getting a sense of where in the machinery this is falling.
right. That was just me speculating for no reason off the top, but it just goes to show that I think New York City, at least in terms of its investigative arm right now, is doing some good things. And they're claiming that Chipotle owes its workers $150 million plus in back pay for thousands of violations. So can you talk about those violations and just take us through what's happening right now in New York?
Yeah. So when you look at the complaint, it's just astonishing in that it's almost exactly 600,000 violations of a couple labor laws that the city has recently enacted, which, right, is just an incredibly large number. And so that's what first caught my attention when I sort of saw that this was being filed. And so the period covers from 2017 to towards the end of 2019. So it's only a 2-year period. And the complaint is mostly about New York City's Fair Workweek Law, which was enacted in 2017 to give fast food workers a little more stability in their scheduling. So, for example, they're supposed to post, any fast food company in New York City is supposed to post the schedule 2 weeks in advance. And if they make any changes in that 2-week period, so that workers have less than 2 weeks notice on their schedule, they have to pay a premium to the worker, right? A monetary amount for the inconvenience. Similarly, I don't know if you've ever worked a job like this, Emma, but I have worked in coffee shops where we had to do clopening, is what we called it.
Ice cream store. So similar situation.
Right. And so you're closing down the store and then you're rushing home to try to get enough sleep before working the opening shift. So this law also covers clopening and says that workers actually have to agree with written consent to work a clopening, back and forth shift like that. And they get $100 premium again in pay. And so these are things that Chipotle was violating. According to the complaint, Chipotle was basically paying no mind to this law at all. New York had previously filed a complaint against Chipotle. And this one notes that while Chipotle made some attempts to comply with the law, it was still systematically disregarding it. And so the complaint, estimates, obviously these are not proven, their allegations, but in the complaint, the estimation by the city is that workers were experiencing around 3 violations a week. And so the back pay that you mentioned, they would be owed around $23,000 each. And that's for Chipotle's roughly 6,500 workers in New York City.
Wow. So is that really what's the extent of what's covered under the Fair Work Week Law, and essentially where they pinpointed that Chipotle fell short on?
Yeah, so that's the key part of the violations the complaint is about. But there's also a sick leave law that New York passed in, I believe, 2014. That is also part of the complaint. So the city says that Chipotle routinely denied employees requests to use sick time, illegally required employees to find a replacement worker, or took disciplinary action against them for using sick time. So one worker I spoke to for this article, for example, had a sick daughter and a sick dad, and she had taken a sick day to take care of them, which Chipotle, according to this complaint, was saying workers could not do, even though the law says that they can take sick days to care for loved ones that are ill. She then got sick herself caring for these workers. She took another day, and at that point, she was illegally fired. And what she told me is that the company said to her, you're using too many sick days, you're harming the company. And she ultimately did get her job back after 3 months, but it took both the city's assistance as well as 32BJ, which is the local of SEIU, the union that organizes with Chipotle workers in New York City. They all had to come together just to get her job back.
Wow. So that's Luisa Mendez, who you spoke to. And I thought that was a particularly egregious example, as you mentioned. And you also cite in your piece, and I'm not exactly sure if this is a part of the official complaint, but the incident at the East 161st Bronx Chipotle, where basically the workers in the Bronx walked out because of COVID-19 terrible workplace conditions. And maybe that didn't cover the time frame that's being considered here, but can you talk about that instance?
Yeah. So I actually spoke to some of those workers, a couple of them at that store, for a previous article that I wrote, I think around 6 months ago, about what was going on at Chipotle during the pandemic, which you shouldn't surprise you if you look at this complaint or even the article I wrote about it, that, you know, these problems have continued and only gotten sort of more terrifying when you add in a pandemic. So those workers had found out that there was an outbreak at their store, and originally their management told them that they were going to close the store. And the workers were on shift, and they were then informed sort of last minute that the store would be remaining open. And so they got together, they started talking to each other in the kitchen, and they said, you know, we're walking out, we're not accepting this. And there have actually been a series of walkouts throughout the pandemic in New York City Chipotles. I think this, at least from what I've seen, this was the most successful one, in that the response they ultimately got from the company was that the store was closed for 2 weeks for cleaning, and the company actually paid them to quarantine, paid the workers to quarantine, which is something Chipotle workers had been asking for everywhere throughout the pandemic. And, you know, the company had refused, as many other companies have refused, to pay workers to quarantine. But the workers at this store uniquely got it because of their shop floor action. I'll also just add that in that previous article I'd written, I also spoke to a worker, and this is just a shocking situation. I spoke to a worker who was bitten by a rat at a New York City Chipotle, and the company had already known there was an infestation in the store. 4 workers were bitten by rats and actually had to go to the hospital, obviously, because if you're bitten by a rat, you want to make sure you don't catch anything. But the company had ultimately, they had closed the store, but they kept asking the workers to come in to clean it themselves. Which is just so egregious. Obviously, you should get an exterminator, not ask your, you know, workers who are making minimum wage to deal with rats. And the store only closed down when a manager was then bitten by one of the rats. So this is the situation at Chipotle. I mean, I write about labor for a living. I talk to workers all the time, and I have to say, you know, the stuff I hear from Chipotle workers is just way far and above as far as outrages than almost any other company I've ever, you know, written about.
Well, last we spoke, we were talking about the Amazon unionization effort in Bessemer. And I will say I live in Brooklyn. I've lived in Manhattan. I have accidentally been touched by a rat, a powerful rat that, you know, ran into my foot, basically my bare foot. That was like in and of itself something I couldn't stand. I can't even imagine being bitten by it, and also being forced to be put in that situation by a company that's evaluated at how much? That's valued at how much? How much money approximately is Chipotle worth? I think you cited some $1 billion figure in your piece.
That's a good question. I actually don't have the number in front of me, but I mean, for example, one thing I write in the piece is that the CEO had his pay double over the pandemic, and actually is the 12th highest paid CEO in the country. And the highest paid restaurant CEO in the country.
Wow.
I mean, Chipotle is doing well. Their stock's, you know, up. They're making money, and they have just announced that they're planning to open, I think, 200 more stores in the near future. So they've made out great. It's the workers that haven't made out so well in the past year.
Right. So as you mentioned, the complaint in New York lists almost 600,000 violations, which is, as you said, an enormous figure. Chipotle's slogan is food with integrity. Now, obviously, there's no integrity involved here. I want to get a little bit into that, but I do want to touch on the fact that Chipotle, and this just hasn't been local to New York, has experienced many health concerns. So it's not just they're not showing integrity to their workers. There have been E. coli outbreaks multiple times, hepatitis you cite. So, I mean, they're cutting corners not just for their employees, but their customers as well.
Right. I mean, at least my assumption is, you know, before I'd ever written about Chipotle or talked to Chipotle workers in a systematic way, I still knew Chipotle as the place that was always having disease outbreaks, the E. coli, the neurovirus. It was sort of like a joke that you might get sick if you eat at Chipotle. And I say that as someone who, you know, when I was especially in Boston around college campuses. There was always Chipotle. I ate there. But it does have this image that, it presents as healthier than other fast food places, but there's sort of hints I think for the public that this isn't the case. Right. And so those food outbreaks are one. I would just add that another sort of development at Chipotle is that last year, Massachusetts fined them over $1 million for systematically and regularly violating the state's child labor laws.
Hi, I'm Sam Seder. You can watch the rest of this interview and more on our Peacock show, which streams at 5 p.m. weekdays on The Choice from Peacock TV.